Hello and welcome to the Vine Life Podcast. I'm Tony Clark, your host. Today I'm privileged to have Fuz Rana on with us today. And Fuz Rana, he's a biochemist. He's the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. And once again, Reasons to Believe is an organization dedicated to communicating the powerful scientific case for God's existence and the Bible's reliability to Christians and non-Christians alike. And how are you today, Fuz?
I'm doing great, Tony. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
Well, it's an honor to have you here. And so I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, Fuz, and I hope from my end they make sense. So I'd like to start in the foundation or the beginnings of your search for, I guess, for Christ, becoming a believer. But let's talk about your faith. You're coming to faith as a young man. And so the complexity of the cell had something to do with that, didn't it?
It did. It most definitely did. I was an agnostic when I was entering into graduate school. I didn't know if God existed or not. I wasn't sure, about the God question, and honestly could have cared less. I was really focused on my studies in biochemistry and wanted desperately to A, survive graduate school, and B, hopefully one day matriculate to be a biochemist. And I had embraced an evolutionary perspective on things as a result of my time as an undergraduate student, where I just thought that the origin and the design and the history of life could be explained through evolutionary means. And it was really being confronted with the elegance and the sophistication and the beauty of the cell's chemical systems that convinced me that there had to be a creator.
Fuz, I was watching part of the documentary that's been out a number of years ago, or came out a number of years ago by Ben Stein. It's called Expelled. And I think at the time he was either interviewing a scientist or a biologist in that field, and he was talking about Darwin's view of the cell. And I think that Darwin had a very simplified view of the complexity of the cell. And Ben Stein was asking the scientist, he was asking the question, if Darwin thought the complexity was a Buick, in your opinion, what we know now, what is the complexity of the cell? What do we know about the...
Yeah. Well, and I would say, in keeping with the idea that, Darwin's view of the cell was a Buick, I would say it would be a really complex, vibrant, metropolis like Los Angeles, for example. That would be, to me, a great analogy for the complexity of the cell, because at first glance it looks to be completely disorganized, but there's an underlying order that is rather impressive, when you look at the cell. But, when I was a graduate student, what captured my interest, again, were things like the elegance, the sophistication. There appeared to be an ingenuity to the cell. And that, to me, really I would say is the intuition of design. And in my experience, a lot of people, when they really first encounter the complexity of the cell and they begin to get a sense for what's going on inside the cell, maybe they see some computer animations of different biochemical processes, they too have that intuition of design, where you'll hear people say, I can't believe anybody would think that this is the product of evolution. And the challenge really, is how do you take that intuition of design and formulate it into something that's a more rigorous, case for design, a more rigorous statement for design. And one of the things that I think is very helpful is to draw on the work of William Paley, the British natural theologian who in the late 1700s wrote a book called Natural Theology, where he presents the Watchmaker argument. And, Paley, this is a very interesting argument, because Paley is comparing a watch and a rock, where he argues, well, we know a rock can be explained through natural processes, but a watch requires a watchmaker. And so we have a very different explanation. So why do we conclude that a watch requires a watchmaker but not a rock? And he goes on to identify a number of attributes of the watch that reflect the work of a human being, of a designer. And, I find that to be a very useful framework when I look at biochemical systems, because one of the things that I find astounding is that that biochemical systems have as their hallmark features the same qualities and characteristics that we would recognize elsewhere as the work of a human designer in object systems or devices produced by human beings. And just, I mean, there's countless examples I could go into, but one of them that I find to be really fascinating has to do with the cell processes that involve DNA. And DNA is a very long strand-like molecule that is made up of these subunits that are called nucleotides, and there are 4 different nucleotides that are used to build DNA. These are called the genetic letters because it's the sequence of those genetic letters that actually contain information that the cell uses to build itself and then to direct its operations. So sometimes DNA is called the blueprint of life or life's instruction manuals. But it's in effect digital information, meaning that the information is in discrete units. And it's the combination of those units that constitutes information. That's essentially digital information. Well, it turns out that a computer scientist by the name of Leonard Adleman a number of years ago was studying molecular biology, and he noted that there's this eerie similarity between what happens when DNA replicates or is transcribed or is repaired and a computer operation, where he argued that the cell's machinery that manipulates the digital information in DNA is literally operating like a computer system. It's an ensemble of these biochemical Turing machines, which are these abstract machines that are the foundation for computer science, the theoretical framework for computer science. And so, you know, he argued that this is in effect a computer operation or a set of computer operations inside the cell, and it inspired him to develop a new area of technology called DNA computing, where scientists are literally building computers now from DNA and the proteins in the cell that manipulate DNA. And these computers are wet computers that are in these little tiny Eppendorf test tubes that are about that big, and they're more powerful than the most powerful silicon-based supercomputer system that we've ever built. And so to me, it's mind-blowing to think that, in effect, what you're looking at the core of the cell's operations are these computer operations that are more sophisticated than any computer system that we could ever hope to build. So much so that it's inspiring a new generation of computer technology. And so we know today that when we see computers, we conclude that computers are the work of a mind, right? And it's because they have attributes that reflect, again, like a watch, the work of designers, human designers. And so when we see those same features inside the cell, you know, to me, I think using the watchmaker reasoning, this is a good reason to think that this is indeed the work of a mind. And so I could go on for hours talking about this kind of design evidence that we see, but I think the watchmaker analogy is very helpful in terms of really formalizing that case for design.
And just to follow up to that, Fuz, and I think I asked you this as well regarding astronomy, but with your expertise, I guess, in biochemistry, other biochemists that are specialized in the field, they see the complexity of the watch as well, but they don't come out and see that there's a watchmaker, but you do. And what is it about maybe the human heart, just in your opinion, that you can see the complexities of it, but you say, well, this just happened by random chance or something like that? What's the heart there?
Yeah, and that's a fascinating question, and it's something that I've thought about quite extensively, because nobody denies that biochemical systems are elegant. They're sophisticated. There's an ingenuity to them. They have this appearance of design. Everybody that works on these systems stands in awe of these systems. And yet some people like me, see a creator's handiwork. Other people just, wave their hands and say, well, evolution is the way to explain it. And, I don't really know the answer to that question. I think some of it may be a hard issue. I think some of it is that scientists are not really trained to think philosophically or theologically. They think scientifically. And, the framework in science is methodological naturalism, that you are only permitted to pursue mechanistic explanations for phenomena in nature, materialistic mechanistic explanations. And so in that framework, I think many scientists who don't think about philosophy or theology look at these systems and say, well, it must have ultimately an evolutionary explanation. And so I think some of it is like a sociological phenomena that's where, again, and so I find that if you're able to begin to get scientists to think philosophically about these kind of issues, I think, many times you can help people see the openness, or they become more open to the design evidence. But ironically, when I present the design argument to engineers, they immediately respond. And I think part of it too is that biologists typically don't have any experience trying to build things. But when you engage an engineer who tries to build things, they have a very good sense for when something is elegantly designed. And they have a very good sense as to what it takes to create that designed system. And so I think engineers respond to the design argument much more readily than do life scientists. But biochemists, compared to other life scientists, tend to be much more oriented towards responding to design, because biochemists are also familiar with the fact that we don't have evolutionary models that can explain the origin of life. So the origin of biochemistry is the origin of life. And everybody who works in that area knows, we can't, at this point in time, produce a good explanation for, how life could emerge through evolution. Biochemists are aware of that, and that gives them a much more openness to the design argument.
The complexity of the cell, you talked about that was, I guess, a catalyst for your coming to faith, or one of the catalysts. But you also talked about in your bio about the Sermon on the Mount. There was something about the Sermon on the Mount and the Gospels that was another catalyst to bring you to faith. Can you go into a little bit more detail on that, please?
Yeah, sure. Well, when I came to the conviction that there had to be a creator, that led me to ask two other questions. Who is that creator, and how do I relate to that creator? Now, I had very little theological or philosophical training at that point in my life. And so I naively began to think about that question and started going down a path of universalism or religious pluralism, where I argued, well, maybe, God is revealing himself to different people at different times through the different religions of the world. And, I naively looked at these religions, at least superficially, and saw that, at least from a moral standpoint, they taught the same thing. Now, today, I realize that approach is doomed to fail, because there's a lot of things about the world's religions that are in sharp contradistinction to one another, about the nature of reality, the nature of God, that mean they all can't be true. Either one of them is true and all are false, or all are false, but they all can't be true. But again, I was naive at that time. And I think part of that motivation too probably reflected my upbringing. My mom came from a Catholic background. She was a non-practicing Catholic. My father was from India. He was a Muslim, a devout Muslim. He was also a man of science. He was a nuclear physicist. And so growing up in my home, I had parents with two very different religious perspectives. Now, my father, being devout, was much more practice his faith. I remember him getting up every morning, going through a ritual cleansing, laying out a prayer carpet facing the east, praying. He would carry a prayer booklet in Arabic, in his breast pocket next to his heart. But my mom, for all intents and purposes, really didn't practice her faith. The only time she did was when she was around her parents, who were devout Catholics. So when we would visit them, or they would visit us, we would all go to Catholic church. So I had some exposure to two, religious systems, and I'm sure that in part opened me up to this notion of religious pluralism. It's also, I had a fair amount of exposure to Islam growing up. In fact, I even dabbled in Islam a little bit as a teenager, reciting the Shahada. I began to read the Quran in English, at least in English translation. I learned how to pray. So I would pray, by myself or with my father. But part of Islamic theology lends itself to religious pluralism. While Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, Muslims believe that Jesus was a prophet, that Moses, that Abraham, that David were prophets, that God, that they believe that the parts of the Old Testament, the Gospels in the New Testament, are part of God's revelation to humanity, though corrupted, and so that lends itself to a type of religious pluralism, at least with respect to the three great monotheistic religions of the world. So being in that environment, I think it naturally led me to, again, being open to some type of religious pluralism. That changed, however, when I met a pastor named Johnny Withrow, who had a small Pentecostal church in downtown Charleston, West Virginia. And when I met Johnny, he ultimately married my wife and I. He challenged me to read the Bible. He asked me, have you ever read the Bible? And other than reading Genesis 1, the answer was no. And he said, well, then how do you know it's not true? And I thought, well, this is an interesting point. So I started in the Gospel of Matthew and was intrigued by the Christmas story. Growing up in a home where Christianity wasn't at the forefront, I heard the Christmas story, but had no idea where it came from. So that was intriguing to me. And then that led me into the Sermon on the Mount, which was an incredible experience. I was attracted to the person of Christ. I thought that what Christ was teaching about authentic righteousness was true, but I realized that there was no way I could ever live up to that standard. I was doomed to fail horribly, and so I recognized my sin and my failure. And so here the person of Christ was both attractive and yet at the same time deeply condemning and it was at that point in time where I was wrestling with those issues that I had a religious experience where there was a presence that was in the room with me. I was by myself, that was as real as if you and I were in the same room together. And I never had an experience like that before. I never had one after that. And it was that encounter with, I think, a theophany of sorts that convinced me that what I was reading in the Sermon on the Mount was true, that the person of Christ was this special person that must be who Christians claim him to be. And one of Johnny Withrow's friends gave me a little pamphlet on how to become a Christian. And so I pulled that out and I read through that and recognized that not only was I a sinner, but that Christ, through his death on the cross, made a way for me to be reconciled to my Creator by embracing his work on the cross. So it was Christ revealed through Scripture, a religious experience connected to that, and it was Christ revealed through the record of nature that really brought me to or put me in the position to have an encounter with Christ.
Wow, it's quite an incredible story, Fuzz. So let's fast forward a little bit. And now, how did you hook up, or how did you become a part of Reasons to Believe? What happened there?
Yeah. Well, after finishing up my postdocs, I took a job in R&D at a Fortune 500 company and settled into a comfortable life of working at an interesting and fun job, seeing my family begin to grow, becoming involved in my church. And that comfortable existence was interrupted when my father, who was, again, a Muslim, died. And I was unable to really reach my father with the gospel. And in fact, when I converted to Christianity, it led to a fracturing of our relationship. And we were estranged at the point of his death. And, I there was it was an incredible time on a number of different levels. But as a result of that, I realized that I had an obligation as a Christian to share my faith with others, so that people knew the truth and that people would not die apart from Christ like my father had died. And I began really on a quest. I can remember praying, God, I'm just a scientist, but please use me any way that you can. And through that process, I was introduced to a book called Creator and the Cosmos, written by Hugh Ross, and later introduced to the ministry. And it was fascinating to me how I never saw conflict between science and my faith, but how Hugh went one step further and used science as really a bridge to the Christian faith, and ultimately a bridge to the gospel. And when I saw what he was doing, it was like, wow, this is exciting, that I am equipped as a scientist to share my faith, because now I know how to point people to a creator from the discoveries in science, and how I can use those discoveries to demonstrate the credibility of the Bible. And it literally was transformative. And I now had the tools to match my compassion for others and my passion for the gospel. I had now the tools to really engage non-believers, knowing that I could go in the presence of any scientist in the world and give them a robust scientific reason why, as a scientist, I believe that not only God exists, but that Christianity is true. And it was through that discovery that I became connected with Reasons to Believe as a volunteer, and then God opened up doors 22 years ago for me to become part of the team at Reasons to Believe. And I was motivated to join RTB because in my mind I felt like there was nothing more important I could do as a scientist than actually show people how science points to a creator. Anything else that I would do as a scientist would pale in importance to that.
Now, speaking of Reasons to Believe, I'm going to go off in left field here for just a little bit. Speaking of office attire at Reasons to Believe, I hear that you wear at times superhero shirts, and I've got to ask you: is it DC or Marvel?
I'm conflicted on that. You know, I probably would lean in the Marvel direction, but I'm not a Marvel over DC type of person. I'm on a Batman kick these days. So Batman and Daredevil are the two characters that I'm most fascinated with today. But if you press me, Spider-Man is the ultimate superhero.
Yeah, I kind of lean toward Marvel, but it's been years since I've collected comics. But I was like a '70s, '80s guy, and I've still got all of those comics from those years, and they're like in my basement. So
Yeah, let me tell you a quick story about comics. When I was a little kid, we were living on just off the campus of West Virginia Institute of Technology, where my father was a professor. And just down the street, there was a little corner market called Fannon's Market. And I would collect pop bottles, and I'd go in and cash my pop bottles in to buy a candy bar or get a soda pop. And one day I was in there, and he had a whole bunch of comic books he was selling, but all the covers were ripped off. And what happened is he got them from the local newsstand at the drugstore in the town. And what they had to do is, if they didn't sell the comic book, they would rip off the cover and send it back to the distributor as proof that they didn't sell it, and then they were supposed to dispose of the comics. Now, the idea of ripping a cover off a comic book is horrifying, but those are different times. So Mr. Fannin figured out how to get those comic books, and he would sell them for like a penny a piece, but you had to buy 10 of them, 10 for a dime. And so I was like on this tear to buy to find pop bottles. So I had this comic book collection where none of my comics had covers on them. And then it was, really, I don't know, about 5 or 6 years ago, I got reintroduced to the world of comic books, and so I'm an avid comic book collector now. So, and I've got a little bit of disposable income that allows me to do that. So, anyway.
So your wife allows you to use that disposable income in that way.
I've got an allowance that I can spend on comics.
You know, the typical story is you collect comics as a kid and through your teens, and then you go away to college, and your mom throws everything out. And then they're valuable. It's like a original Superman comic or something that you had, and it's trashed. So, Fuzz, you spoke a little bit about your dad. I'd like to dig in just a little bit deeper on that. Um, you were raised by a Muslim father, and you came to faith in Christ. What when I read that story, 2 Corinthians 1:4 kind of stuck out to me, and I'll just read that verse. And I'm paraphrasing for the most part, but it says, "The God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have or have received from God." So, when I read that verse, I think of times in my life. I can't relate to your experience, but I can relate to others' experiences that are kind of unique to me. And in the health, in terms of, I've had poor health in my past, but I can relate to people that are going through similar circumstances, and I can say, well, this is how God has comforted me. So I'm going to comfort you with the same comfort that God has comforted me with. And I'm just curious, with your experience with your dad coming to Christ and being basically from a Muslim background, have you been able to comfort other believers who are in similar circumstances?
Uh, I mean, to some extent, I mean, to me, I think, you know, as far as I can tell, my father died as a Muslim, and we were, estranged, at the time of his death. And there was the weekly. I mean, he was, on his deathbed for a week to 10 days, and so during that time, we would visit him in the hospital. He wasn't really conscious for that time. He was, really in a bad way. But through that time, it was amazing how the Holy Spirit worked in my heart, where, I was able to thank God for my father and what he meant for me. Even though we were estranged, he was a very harsh man who was a no nonsense person. But I realized that he raised me that way to prepare me for life and for, the difficulties of life. So I was able to not only forgive him, but really be grateful for who he was and what he meant to me, and really be able to view his life with compassion, and again, gratitude. So it was remarkable how the Holy Spirit really healed that relationship, at least, from my perspective. And I really harbor no bitterness at all towards my father, or no anger or anything. God, but through that process, that passage you read is a very powerful passage. But what gave me comfort was the character of God, because I from Scripture and from my experience encountering God, I know that God is a God of justice. He's a God who's righteous, but he's also a God who's loving and merciful and kind. And so I trusted putting my father in God's hands, knowing that there was, that God was going to be just and going to be merciful. And I don't know where my father is. I don't know if I'll see him again, but I trust that whatever is in God decides, it is going to be the right decision. And so to me, there's a lot of people, not just people who have relatives that die as Muslims, but people have relatives that die as non-believers. And that would be my counsel to them is, thank God for their lives and trust in who God is, it really, what happens to them is beyond really our capacity to influence. But it also, I think, should motivate us all to realize, again, like, God motivated me through the death of my father, that we have, again, an obligation out of love for others to really share our faith.
And let's stay on this topic just a little bit. I've heard over the last number of years, I've heard of folks that are in predominantly Islamic countries that really have little access to the gospel. They've had dreams, and they've had, I guess, in some form, appearances of Jesus. And through those dreams, if you will, they've come to give their life to Christ. Do you put much validity in those dreams?
I do. I've interacted with some Muslims who have converted to Christianity who describe, that kind of experience where Christ appeared to them in dreams. And they are people that I consider trustworthy, so I have no reason to think, otherwise. I had a religious experience as well. And I know other Christians who've had religious experiences that were critical to their conversion, or critical to key life decisions where they were at a crossroads. And that crossroads many times involved, going into ministry where God, they experienced God in extraordinary ways. So I think this is one way that God does indeed reach us is through dreams, through visions, through these experiences.
That's interesting. So it gives it just shows us that God's not limited by the laws of physics, if you will. Uh, let's switch gears a little bit, Fuzz, if that's cool with you. So I'm gonna go into an article that you've written fairly recently, but it's about archaeological digs, and I see archaeological digs, the photographs of them anyway, and they're unearthing everything from cave art, ancient cave art, to mosaic structures, to sometimes musical instruments. And there seems to be a common thread of ancient humans possessing the ability to create things that are beautiful and pleasing, or aesthetically pleasing. And you had an article a while back that was titled "The Argument from Beauty: Can Evolution Explain Our Aesthetic Sense?" And this is your quote here. So forgive me if I butcher it. But you said, "I maintain the biblical view of human nature accounts for our aesthetic sense. For if we are made in God's image, then we are creators ourselves. And the art, music, stories that we create arise as a manifestation of God's image within us. And as a Christian theist, I am skeptical that the evolutionary paradigm can offer a compelling explanation for our aesthetic sense." What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, you know, uh, one of the characteristics of human beings, again, is not only the fact that we appreciate beauty, but we want to create beauty, and that we're obsessed with it. It's very much endemic to our very nature. And so the question is, how do we explain this? And, from an evolutionary perspective, this is an outstanding problem. How do we account for our aesthetic sense? And, one, idea is that, there's some kind of adaptive value, to our aesthetic sense. Other models are, well, there really is no true adaptive value to our aesthetic sense, but rather it's just simply a byproduct of evolution. It's what the late evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould called an evolutionary spandrel, that it's connected to some other capacity that we have that is critical to our survival, but because it's connected to it yet doesn't have any use, it persists in our in our evolutionary history. Others say it's just simply the product of chance process, that we just simply had the right combination of genes by chance that led to our capacity for aesthetics, and again that it has very little adaptive value. The problem with the byproduct model and the genetic drift model is that it's not that our aesthetic sense is expressed incidentally. It's that we're obsessed with it. It's that we're obsessed with beauty. We want to create beautiful things. We want to create stories and songs and then immerse ourselves in this imaginary setting, and we give up, at times, experience of the world around us to inhabit these aesthetic worlds that we create, these aesthetic experiences that we create. There's so much energy devoted to that it detracts from our survivability. And so therefore it can't just be an evolutionary spandrel, or it can't be chance combination of genes. There has to be some real value to it. And so that leads people to think, well, maybe there's an adaptive value, but the problem there is, one model is that, well, we are attracted to things that are beautiful that promote our survivability. That we're attracted to a beautiful stream in a shaded area because we know there's resources there that will help us to survive. Problem is, we're also attracted to things that are beautiful that will kill us, right? That are deadly animals or deadly landscapes that we can't really survive in. Others have argued, well, this is just simply our aesthetic sense is a manifestation of our capacity to see patterns in the world, and that we train ourselves to see these patterns because that pattern recognition promotes our survivability. But again, the problem is that we're obsessed with aesthetics to the point where we don't want to just get good enough to survive. We're obsessed with aesthetics, and we will do everything we can, even sacrifice, to get as good as we possibly can, in music and art and in other areas that again have no real survival value. So to me, evolutionary explanations just seem to kind of fall short when you really press on them. And so to me, I think the best explanation is that this is really a manifestation of the image of God and some quality that we uniquely possess. No other creature creates in the way that we creates for aesthetic purposes. The things they build might be beautiful, but they're not building them for beauty. They're building them for survivability.
Yeah, and it kind of what you're saying there, it kind of goes back, I think, in my eyes, to uh, two scientists can see, two sets of eyes can see the same facts about biochemistry, and they come to two different conclusions about origins. And it's like that watch, that intricate watch. It's only not only got the complexity, but it's got the beauty. And so there has to be a watchmaker that is not only beautiful and creates beautiful things, but is intricate as well and creates intricate things. So yeah, great explanation. We'll have links to those articles below the video as well. Go ahead.
What I like about the argument from beauty, if I could just, is that it's an argument that I think is accessible to the average person. A lot of apologetics can get really quite heady, can be philosophically and theologically complex, can even be scientifically complex. But the argument from beauty is a fairly accessible argument. And what I like about it is we all have experienced beauty. We all want to immerse ourselves in beauty, and it's something that we share as human beings. And so what a great bridge to have conversations with other people about beautiful things, and then pose the big question about, why is it that we live in a world that's so beautiful? Why is it that we are obsessed with beauty? And I think that's the type of apologetics that I think is accessible to a lot of people, that is a non-threatening way to talk about the big questions and to share your faith as a Christian.
Yeah, you're talking about beauty. It harkens back to what you were talking about. There's something that was beautiful about the comic book cover that was ripped off. There's something wrong when it's ripped off, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. That we react violently, to works of art being destroyed. We see that as a travesty. If the art from an ancient civilization is looted and destroyed, we grieve over that. That's a really interesting point, Tony, that you bring up that I never thought about before. But why is that, right?
Yeah, there's something horribly wrong when you see something beautiful that took multitudes of hours to create, and it's suddenly destroyed. There's something in our spirit that says there's something wrong about that. So let's turn the street here, turn the corner, and go to, I hate to be a downer here, but let's talk about cancer. You wrote, and cancer is something that all of us can relate to. Either we've lost loved ones that have had it, or God forbid we'll have it in the future, or someone that we know has it currently. Fuz, I think of a musician a couple of years ago who passed. He passed of brain cancer, and he was a devout, I believe, an atheist. And he talked about if a God is so loving and so powerful, why did he create a creation that's so inherently flawed? With cancer, for example. And again, cancer is something that all of us can relate to. And you stated a question, if in your article, if a creator is responsible for the designs found in biochemistry, then why are so many biochemical systems seemingly flawed, inelegant, and poorly designed? And in addition, you wrote this. You wrote, couldn't a creator design biochemistry so that a disease as horrific as cancer would never be possible, particularly if the creator is all powerful, all knowing, and all good? And that kind of harkens back to this musician who passed. He kind of had the same, he at least expressed these same feelings. If there's a God who's all loving, all powerful, why did he create something that's flawed and will die? And the title of your article, I'll get that in just a moment, but can you flesh this out for us a little bit? What did you mean by the words that you stated?
Yeah, and as you point out, Tony, when we make the design argument and we point to the incredibly elegant designs that we see in biology, the most common rejoinder is that, well, what about all the flawed designs? That there are these designs that seem to be suboptimal, that seem to be error prone. Why would God create a world like that? Wouldn't that be, wouldn't it be better just to think that the designs that we see are really the product of evolution, not the product of a all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good creator? Because either God doesn't exist or he isn't all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good is kind of the rejoinder. And I'm highly sympathetic to that argument, but that argument takes on some very powerful emotional appeal when you talk about diseases like cancer, which we all, again, see as being, horrific. And particularly when cancer strikes younger people or children, that is absolutely horrific, and it really brings up the problem of evil. And to me, I think the response to that has to be couched in, again, really a response to why are there so-called bad designs in nature. And before I make that a point as in terms of explaining, again, the whole idea of how bad designs can be compatible with a good creator and an all-powerful creator, we need to step back and ask the question, well, what kind of world would we expect God to create? We see in Scripture that God is unchanging, right? That Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So a God like that would be expected to create a world that reflects his character, which would be a world that is unchanging, a world where there's constancy, a world where there's predictable. It's predictable, but this is also a gift that God has given us, because if we live in a predictable world, it means that we have the wherewithal to survive because we can understand cause and effect. If we understand cause and effect, that allows us to not only survive, but it allows us to then take the resources in the world around us and build things with them. It makes science and technology possible. So you could see that constant world as being a providential gift that God has given us. There's one other reason why a world needs to be made up of constant laws, unchanging laws, and that's because it leads to a moral universe. In other words, morality is impossible in a universe that is where the laws of physics are unchanging, or ever changing, because I can't be held morally accountable if I can't predict what my actions are going to lead to, right? And if God's intervening to alter the laws of nature at his whim, then maybe to prevent something bad from happening, it means that then how do I know that when I engaged in an action that God wasn't going to intervene to essentially alleviate the consequences of my action? So a moral universe requires constant laws of nature. So having said that, there's good reasons why God would create a world like the one that we're in. But once you have constant, unchanging laws of nature, you inevitably are going to wind up in a world where there are trade-offs, where you have systems that are complex that are supposed to accomplish multiple objectives that might conflict with one another. You can't have systems like that that are perfect. The components of that system have to be suboptimal to have an overall optimal system. And that means you're led to trade-offs. So now let's take a look at bad designs in biology in general. Many times when we study these systems, we discover that these are really not flawed designs, but rather designs that have been intentionally suboptimized to produce an overall optimal performance because of trade-offs. And I could go through a large number of examples, but let's take cancer as an example. You know, cancer is a complex disease. The etiology of cancer is complex, but many cancers are actually the result of mutations in the genomes of the cells in our body, where those mutations essentially convert a normal cell into a cancerous cell, into a cell that is going to proliferate in an uncontrolled manner. Now, and those mutations can be caused by internal biochemical phenomena or external insults like chemical insults or radiation impinging upon the genome. And so those mutations essentially happen, and these mutations are inevitable because we live in a world that's governed by constant laws of physics, where those laws are the laws of the first and second laws of thermodynamics. And if those laws weren't in place, life would be impossible because you need to have the thermodynamic laws that we have for life to exist in our universe. But the net consequence is our genomes are going to undergo mutation, and that makes us susceptible to cancer. But it turns out that we have this very elaborate repair mechanism in place that will correct damage to DNA. And so most of the mutations that take place in our DNA are actually corrected, and they never see the light of day. They never exert their negative consequence. But yet if that repair mechanism operated at 100%, to repair 100% of the mutations, it would consume so much cellular resources that there's no way that metabolism would be possible. So there's a balance between repairing the DNA sufficiently to promote cell survivability, but not excessively to keep life from actually existing. So the repair process is optimal, but it means that there's some mutations that will eventually take place in our genomes. But when people have surveyed cells in our body, they discover that our cells are riddled with mutations in their genomes, and most of those cells never become tumorigenic. And there are only certain mutations that are called driver mutations that will actually lead to cancer. And even then they discover that cells in our body that with driver mutations never turn into cancer. So it's very rare actually that a cell will actually become lead to a tumor, become cancerous and lead to a tumor. And even then our immune system is able many times to clear out those cancerous cells. And so we have 30 trillion cells in our body that are constantly being subjected to mutation. And all it takes is one cell to become cancerous, and then you could potentially develop, cancer. And so people that are working in cancer biology have marveled that cancer is actually as rare as it is when you consider how frequent mutations are, how frequent driver mutations are, and how many cells we have in our body, and how long that we live. And so, in other words, cancer doesn't reflect a flawed design, but is an inevitability as a result of the trade-offs that exist in biology. And so, in a sense, we could see cancer as being fully compatible with a God who created a good world, who is a good God who's all powerful and all knowing. Now, of course, it doesn't take away the very real tragedy that's connected to cancer. But again, in God's providence, the insights that we're developing about cancer biology are allowing us to develop treatments that mean that cancer isn't an automatic death sentence anymore. That in God's providence, He's provided ways for us to understand this and to to combat it. So, I don't want to be insensitive by any means, but I don't see cancer as really being that big of a problem actually for the design argument.
Yeah, and speaking of God's providence and the medications that we have available today are mind blowing, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But the title of the article that I butchered a little while ago is "Why Would God Create a World Where Cancer Is Possible?" And Fuzz, you concluded with this. I think this is a great conclusion. The Old and the New Testaments teach us that the Creator revealed by scientific discovery has suffered on our behalf and will suffer alongside us in the person of Christ as we walk through the difficult circumstances of life. So, whether we're going through cancer or some other horrific illness, if we've got Christ, we're going to be okay. He's going to get us through. And this life is short. So, but let's go on those themes of medical technologies and God's providence. And I'm going to be respectful of your time here because we're running up close to the hour. But let's talk about the COVID-19 title or the COVID-19 discussion here. And I'm just going to ask these questions quickly. You can certainly go into as much detail as you like or as little detail. But let's speak to Christians here. If you'd speak to believers, followers of Christ, that are skeptical of the vaccines. Not necessarily conspiracy theorists, but they're just skeptical of the vaccines and the information that's put out. Can you talk to them for just a couple of minutes?
Yeah, and I can understand that skepticism because these are a new type of vaccines that have really never been deployed on a large scale in human populations. But these mRNA vaccines that are represented by Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech have been under development for about 30 years. They've been extensively studied, and even before COVID-19 hit, there were already mRNA vaccines that were targeting different viruses that were in small-scale clinical studies that were showing promise. And so, it's remarkable that COVID-19 hit when it did, because if it hit even a few years earlier, we wouldn't have been able to develop vaccines as quickly as we did. But because all this work was taking place and these things were already in these small-scale clinical trials, when COVID-19 hit, the Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech were able to go into the lab and very quickly produce prototypes for the mRNA vaccines and get them into clinical studies and in animal studies and things like that very quickly. So I see these vaccines as part of God's providence, and I think we're going to look at this point in history a number of years from now as a watershed moment in medicine where mRNA technology is now becoming a viable tool in our medical toolkits, and it's going to transform medicine, including not only the treatment of infectious diseases, but the treatment of cancer. The medical community is continuing to monitor side effects to these vaccines. They I think, are being very transparent and very open about potential side effects. For the most part, these are safe vaccines for people to take. And again, there are people that do have side effects, but the side effects are rare and for the most part, can be, easily managed. And so I think, these vaccines are, again, from my perspective, safe and they are effective.
So also the follow-up question to this, and these are questions that I see and I hear discussed. Are the vaccines made from aborted babies in any way?
To me, one of the really important points about these vaccines that I think has not received adequate discussion are pro-life issues connected with these vaccines. And it's not just the mRNA vaccines, but the viral vector vaccines like the ones produced by Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca in the UK. And I think there's a Russian viral vector vaccine as well. And so, let me, these pro-life issues are very real, but they're complex issues that I think have not really received adequate, again, attention. Now, to the question, are these vaccines made with cells from abortions? And the answer is no. That none of the vaccines are made with human cells that are directly taken from aborted tissue. In other words, as somebody who's staunchly pro-life, I can either receive the vaccine or reject the vaccine, and either decision is going to have no bearing on whether or not an abortion takes place, right? The cells that are used there are human cells that have been used to develop the mRNA vaccines, and then there are human cells that have been used to not only develop the viral vector vaccines, but also are necessary to produce them. These human cells have come, however, from the cell lines. It's the HEK 293 cell line, comes from cells that were taken from a single abortion and then cultivated in the lab. And so this is why people make the false or under the false impression that there are aborted cells connected with these vaccines. They're not. These are cell lines, human cell lines, that are, again, developed from from a single abortion that took place in 1972 in the Netherlands, where the purpose of the abortion was to terminate a pregnancy. As a pro-life person, I see that as a horrific evil. But then after the abortion took place, cells were harvested from that embryo and turned into cell lines. And in fact, there's a number of cell lines that are used in medicine today that are derived from aborted tissues. But those cell lines, once they're developed, they're immortal. They will exist, perpetually exist. And so you can use those cell lines without ever having to, again, have another abortion necessarily take place. So there's a big ethical debate that could take place among pro-life people as to whether or not harvesting the cells and then using those cell lines is morally acceptable or not. And people that are pro-life can take very different perspectives on that question. But the bottom line is that by taking the vaccine or refusing the vaccine, you're not, you're not impacting the number of abortions that take place.
Well, in conclusion, thank you for answering that with grace and dignity. It's so rare these days to see someone answer that question honestly like that. So I appreciate that. So, Fuz, in conclusion, what's new on the horizon for you in terms of your books, your speaking your speaking engagements, your podcasts? What's new for Fuz?
Yeah, well, a couple of things I'd like to talk about. One is I have a book that was just published called Fit for a Purpose. So it's looking at the question, does the fine-tuning that we see in the constants of the universe apply to biochemical systems? And then I'm currently in the process of writing a book. Working title is Should We Play God?, where I'm looking at advances in synthetic biology and biotechnology, where we are creating life in the lab and asking the question, really, is this something that we should do as Christians? So it's looking to explain the science and the technology behind some of these types of advances. Why are scientists pursuing these advances? What are some of the ethical questions that arise? And then really looking to create a theological framework for us to think about as Christians advances in synthetic biology, where I'm going to actually introduce the gospel into the conversation. What does the gospel? How does the gospel shape how we think about work in synthetic biology? So that's a project underway. We actually, at Reasons to Believe, have just launched a new video podcast called Stars, Cells, and God, where Hugh and Jeff Zwirink and me are going to go into the studio and talk about new discoveries in science and what those discoveries mean for the Christian faith. It's a weekly podcast that will be launched hopefully sometime in March.
Sounds like you've got your schedule pretty full there. So Fuz, I just want to thank you for coming on the Vine Life podcast. And again, Fuz Rana, the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. Thank you so much, Fuz.
Thanks, Tony, for having me.